introduction, and also thank you to the Cultural Knowledge Consortium for inviting me to present at this webinar. I should mention that although I'm on a one-year assignment to the Center for Complex Operations at National Defense University, I initiated this research while I was at CNA, the Center for Naval Analyses. So without further ado, I'll commence my presentation. So South Sudan became independent in July of 2011, which was a culmination of several decades of North-South as well as South-South conflict. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed with the provision that South Sudan would have a referendum vote to decide whether or not to secede or remain united with Sudan. During the interim period of the CPA, between 2005 and 2011, both Sudan and South Sudan were to make unity attractive. And during this period, South Sudan was faced with competing imperatives. On one hand, it needed to downsize the SPLA by 90,000 soldiers, which was approximately half of what was believed to be the parade of the SPLA at the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. On the other hand, per the CPA, they needed to integrate so-called other armed groups, which included the South Sudan Defense Forces and other sorts of tribal militias, into the SPLA or integrate them into civilian life in order to neutralize the threat that they pose to the peace process. And I should note that at the signing of the CPA, it was believed that up to 50,000 people were members of these various OAGs. But before I delve into my presentation, here's what you should understand about the topic of my research. Since the signing of the CPA, the government of South Sudan has sought to neutralize the threat that non-statutory armed forces pose to peace and stability. Often the preferred approach has not been coercion, but rather accommodation. While contributing to short-term stability, this approach competes with a simultaneous imperative to right-size or reduce the parade of the SPLA from 210,000 to 120,000 over the next 5 years, while undergoing a transformation into a professional conventional military, which is referred to within the SPLA as Objective Force 2017. Various demobilization methods, including disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, are either still in the planning stages or have previously been unsuccessful. Together, the imperative to integrate these armed groups and the stalled demobilization processes have constrained the SPLA's ability to counter internal and external threats and have turned the military into little more than an instrument through which to distribute patronage. During the course of my research in South Sudan, when I would mention what I was researching, people would say, oh, well, it's really that the military or the government is paying people not to fight it, which seemed to me to be a unsustainable way of accommodation. And so that's what piqued my interest in this research topic. So it's an approach that often keeps the peace, but often also falls apart, which I'll get into later in my presentation. And the imperatives I discussed today are two distinct but related processes that have broader national security implications for South Sudan. So here you see a map of South Sudan, and I would just like to draw your attention to a few things. First of all, there's the, I don't know if I have a pointer, but there's the undemarcated border between Sudan and South Sudan, which creates a bit of a border conflict every few months. The states afflicted by armed group violence, both during the Civil War and during the interim period and the post-independence period, tend to be in northeastern South Sudan. And so they're the Greater Upper Nile region, which is Upper Nile states, Greater Upper Nile, which is Upper Nile State, Unity State, and Jonglei State. These areas have a legacy of armed groups supported by the government in Khartoum. They are oil-producing areas, so many of the armed groups that operated during the Civil War provided security for the government in Khartoum to be able to exploit oil resources there or explore for oil in these regions. There's also a problem of small arms and light weapons proliferation due to the porous border with Ethiopia, as well as the inability for the SPLA and the South Sudan Police Force to provide for community security. My presentation will have the following structure. First, I'll lay out the methodology for the study. I will then give an overview of the historical context of armed groups in South Sudan. After that, I'll offer an analysis on South Sudan's approach to armed groups and impediments for integrating non-statutory armed forces into the SPLA. Then I'll talk about the imperative to right-size the SPLA and highlight some of the challenges to demobilization. I will then offer some potential trigger points based on what we understand about the role of armed groups and the government's approach to them. Finally, I'll offer some conclusions based on my research to date. Before I began my research, I thought it was important to clarify exactly which armed groups I was addressing in my study and exactly which processes they would be undergoing. This helped clarify the scope of my research. Non-statutory armed forces are groups that are party to armed conflict as a result of stated incompatibility with the government. They challenge the government's claim on the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. They lack a mandate or authority from formal state institutions and operate largely independent of official state control. They vary in ideology, objectives, strategies, support base, legitimacy, organizational structure, and degree of control over geographic areas. And although they reside outside state control, state officials or agencies may have direct or indirect contact with non-statutory armed forces due to their personal interests, such as kinship ties, opportunities for career advancement, corruption, and clientelism. In South Sudan, when I use the term non-statutory armed forces, these are armed groups that during the interim period of the CPA, they were not recognized by the peace agreement or the interim constitutions of the Republic of Sudan or the government of Southern Sudan. In the post-independence period, which is 2011 to the present, non-statutory armed forces are armed groups that are not recognized by the transitional constitution of the Republic of South Sudan. Another term I used in my research was post-conflict military integration. This is a process of incorporating non-statutory armed forces into a statutory security framework. It is a post-conflict peace-building strategy that is often used in conjunction with political power sharing and the distribution of political positions. Multinational peacekeeping forces or third-party military advisors, if viewed objectively by both sides, can be used as guarantors of a military integration agreement. Resumption of conflict is likely when military integration agreements are not implemented or fall apart. Post-conflict military integration should not be confused with reintegration, which is the final stage of DDR. And in South Sudan, post-conflict military integration is a process that occurs before a decision is made whether or not to demobilize armed groups. And during the course of my interviews, people within the Ministry of Defense told me that armed groups are integrated into the SPLA until a decision is made whether or not they are going to remain within the SPLA or funneled through various demobilization programs, such as the pension program or wounded warriors or DDR. During the course of the study, I also used the term right size to refer to reducing the parade of the SPLA. This includes the process of downsizing, but is not limited to the DDR process. So going back to my analytic approach, I then researched armed group activity during South Sudan's Second Civil War and the status of armed groups during CPA negotiations. I then conducted field research in South Sudan, which consisted of semi-structured interviews with South Sudanese government and military officials, UN DDR personnel, and other relevant subject matter experts. I then assessed challenges to post-conflict integration of non-statutory armed groups into the SPLA, and then determined potential trigger points for future armed group activity. Okay, so the history of armed groups in South Sudan is rather complex, but just for the purposes of staying within my time limits, I'm going to zip through a brief recent history of South Sudan and the role that armed groups played during the Civil War. Okay, so the Boer Mutiny was considered the start of the Second Civil War, but in fact, fighters had returned to the bush since 1978. They were part of the Anyanya movement, which was the Southern opposition during the First Civil War from 1956 to 1972. And so as a result of the poor implementation of the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972, they had returned to the bush since 1978 as Anyanya II. once the Boer Mutiny occurred and John Garang became the leader of the SPLA, these Anyanya fighters came into conflict with the SPLA due to issues of leadership as well as ethnicity, since the Anyanya was primarily a Nuer group, and also in terms of ideology. One of the weaknesses, one could argue, of Anyanya was that it was a group that sought independence for South Sudan at a time when that was not a advantageous position to have in terms of garnering foreign support. John Garang learned that lesson of one of the failures of Anyanya, and he, for various reasons, chose not to explicitly argue for independence, but rather for this new Sudan concept, which was the transformation of a democratic and secular Sudan and united Sudan. So after some infighting between the Anyanya and the SPLA came to dominate the Southern Rebellion. Although other groups emerged in terms of tribal self-defense militias in the Equatoria region in response to ill-behaved SPLA soldiers, or just in terms of like community self-defense. For various reasons, these Anyanya fighters or tribal self-defense movements gathered support from Khartoum for tactical reasons, not for ideological reasons. So the government of Sudan, their decision to use militias to counter the SPLA was in response to ineffective Sudanese armed forces offensives in southern Sudan during the 80s and the low morale of SAF troops. It was also to curtail the momentum of various SPLA military offensives in the 1980s that were rather successful. So in 1991, there was an event called the Nasser coup, which was a split within the SPLA. And that came at a time when the SPLA had been receiving a lot of support from the Mengistu regime in Ethiopia, and that regime was about to collapse. And John Garang had moved some of his forces towards the southern part of southern Sudan in order to try and make a move on Juba, and it had left his soldiers in Upper Nile exposed. And for many reasons, they took this as an opportunity. They thought they were being marginalized, and they took this as an opportunity to overthrow Garang for reasons regarding his opposition to his authoritarian nature, also for opportunism to take advantage of the movement at a time when he was losing his main supporter in Ethiopia, and also later on in terms of ideological differences between Garang's New Sudan ideology of unity but transformation and their own objectives of independence for southern Sudan. Unfortunately for the coup makers, this attempt failed to garner the anticipated support, and it resorted to ethnic violence, which resulted in a South-South civil war. And it resulted in these groups, eventually called the South Sudan Defense Forces, but also called other forces. There was an alphabet soup of forces that I won't get into at this point. It resulted in many of these groups losing credibility and taking on the appearance of primarily newer groups. So the conflict took on an ethnic component. As a result of John Garang being able to monopolize foreign support, these groups had to resort to a tactical alliance with Khartoum. After several years of stalled peace negotiations during the 90s, peace negotiations between the National Congress Party in Sudan and the SPLA in southern Sudan managed to gain new momentum in the early 2000s. In part, in order to streamline the process that had been stagnating for a decade or over a decade, these various armed groups that were operating in southern Sudan outside of the SPLA were excluded from peace negotiations, in addition to the various northern opposition movements that John Garang had been making entrees to over the years. And so what this meant is that the comprehensive peace agreement that was eventually signed in 2005 exalted the National Congress Party in Sudan and the SPLA in southern Sudan as it cemented their dominance within the north and the south respectively. In the South, it also gave Garang a victor's peace, and he had very little incentive to include OAGs in the peace process, which of course created a problem because you had up to 50,000 armed men who did not have a role to play in the new political dispensation of, post-conflict or during the interim period of the CPA. John Garang, as we know, died in a helicopter accident 6 or 7 months after the signing of the SPLA, and there had been a provision in the CPA Protocol on Security Arrangements, which prohibited non-SPLA or non-Sudanese armed forces from operating in Sudan or South Sudan, and it required the integration or demobilization of groups outside of the Sudanese armed forces or the SPLA within 1 year of the CPA signing. So John Garang's death arguably made it easier for his successor, Salva Kiir, to negotiate the Juba Declaration in January of 2006 with the late Paulino Matip, who was at that time the leader of the South Sudan Defense Forces, which was the largest and most coherent of the other armed groups. This agreement diminished the threat that OAGs posed as spoilers to the peace process and averted, many argue, a South-South civil war during the interim period of the CPA. It can also be understood, that is the Juba Declaration, could be understood as a means by which to rectify the exclusion of anti-SPLA groups from CPA negotiations. So the Juba Declaration largely kept the peace between of armed groups that resulted from the way that the SPLM ran the elections. They were viewed to be unfair, undemocratic, and if you look at many of the people who led rebellions after April of 2010, they were people who had tried to run as SPLM candidates, were not allowed to, tried to run as independents, either lost unfairly or took out their grievances because they thought it wasn't a fair election, or there were people who were supposed to gain power as a result of supporting candidates that ran as independents, that is non-SPLA candidates. And some of those leaders are the late Georgia Thor, the late Gatlak Guy, and the one of the current rebels, which is David Yaya, who's operating in Jonglei State. And so some of these armed groups were influenced by perceived marginalization within the SPLA. So outside of the political process, people like Peter Guedet rebelled, it is believed, due to the SPLA officer reshuffling in 2010, where he and some other former SSDF officers were seen as getting positions that were more marginal to the ones they'd previously had. So they're moved out of decision-making positions. Okay, so now I am going to talk about the government's approach to armed groups. The government has adopted a big tent approach under the leadership of Salva Kiir, and it focuses on inclusion to the extent possible in order to mitigate conflict. And it is a prerequisite, it has been a prerequisite for stability during the interim period and in order to secure the path to independence. And in the post-independence period, it's seen as a way to maintain stability at a very critical and fragile time for the new state. Since 2010, the government has largely been unable to take on, since 2006, the SPLA has largely been unable to take on armed groups. I referred to the White Army earlier. The White Army was a collection of Nuer youth who were involved in community self-protection. They had an on-again, off-again relationship, like a very nebulous relationship with various armed groups in South Sudan as well as the government in Khartoum. And they refused to disarm, and they refused to, they basically said, there's no reason we should disarm, we're too powerful. The SPLA at that point was powerful enough and mobile enough to take on the White Army. And many people died, and it mitigated the threat it neutralized the threat that the White Army posed. But since 2006, partly as a result of this military military integration, as well as the fact that the SPLA was no longer, it was transitioning from a guerrilla army to a conventional army. In the process of this transition, it lost the ability to go after these groups. So it actually became easier to, it, it was more beneficial for the government to try and negotiate with these groups rather than taking them on militarily. Of course, if negotiations fall apart, they maintain the option of, going after these groups militarily. So if you look at the way that the government approaches these armed groups now, like if you look at 2010 to the present, the government tries to accommodate these armed groups through a process of amnesty and integration. And as I learned during my research, it's a political process that's driven by the presidency and national security, and then passed on to the SPLA for implementation. So you already see the potential for, for political reasons, an agreement is made with these armed group leaders, and then without any sense of whether or not the integration deal is practical to be implemented, it's then passed on to the SPLA, which of course is reluctant to integrate people that were formerly shooting at it when it has an imperative to demobilize 90,000 soldiers at the same time. So you already see an element of conflict there. So the deal between the government and armed group leaders is contingent on leaders' threat potential. That is, whether they have access to foreign funding, whether how many people they can rally to their defense, whether they have access to weapons, etc. And the process of amnesty and integration is a process that can be derailed by civil military tensions, as I alluded to earlier, between the negotiation and the implementation sides of the government and the military. A lack of oversight in terms of some part of the government that has a foot on both the negotiation and implementation sides in terms of understanding whether or not what is being promised to armed group leaders is actually implementable, as well as an overabundance of stakeholders. And so when I was doing my interviews and trying to flesh out what this negotiation process looked like, people said, well, it appears simple on the outside, but in reality, it gets complicated because a lot of people can get involved in the negotiation process. It's not necessarily streamlined. And the reason for this is that, for example, if you have an armed movement in Jonglei, you could have the government and the state involved in negotiations. You could have the people at SPLA headquarters involved in the negotiations. You could have the regional SPLA commander involved in negotiations. You could have people who were former comrades in arms involved in the negotiations, as well as members of parliament. So there's various people who, for reasons of political ties or power, can get involved in these negotiations, which leads armed group leaders to think that they can raise the price of integrating agreeing to an amnesty and integrating their forces into the SPLA. So as a result, some of these agreements fall apart just because the negotiation process can get very complicated. So some of the impediments to military integration are that increased personnel costs make integration unattractive to the SPLA. As I alluded to on the previous slide, there appears to be little coordination in terms of the SPLA having oversight over what the presidency and national security is agreeing to, like how many soldiers the presidency and national security are agreeing to be integrated into the SPLA, and whether or not that's actually sustainable or affordable for the SPLA. And so as a result, 40% of the budget is spent on personnel salaries, which you could argue is at the expense of budgeting for operations, training, and procurement. So as I referred to on the earlier slide, since 2006, the SPLA has been unable to take on armed groups in many instances. However, and this could be attributed to the fact that a lot of their money is going towards operations or towards personnel costs and not towards operations and improving mobility. Also, another impediment is that the legacy of South-South violence and the absence of reconciliation measures within the SPLA has made the SPLA a deeply fragmented force that lacks cohesion. Another problem is that the harmonization of ranks has been a point of contention during negotiations. And this is usually the case with military integration deals in post-conflict environments. And the result is that the SPLA has a top-heavy structure and field divisions have too many commanders, which is detrimental for good command and control. There's also, as a result of the various groups that were brought into the SPLA after the CPA was signed, there's a diversity of training and experience, which makes it difficult to then, transform into the professional and conventional military that the SPLA seeks per Objective Force 2017. And an example of this is there may be a soldier that was in the SPLA for 10 years, but his experience may not be parallel to a soldier that fought within the South Sudan Defense Forces. They might have different levels of education, they might have different levels of training, and how do you rationalize this in a new force, and is that transparent to the people that it's affecting? Another impediment to military integration is that integration arguably creates incentives for defection, and the infamous Peter Gadet is an excellent example of this. And it could foment resentment on the part of SPLA loyalists. So every time Peter Gadet defects, he's able to negotiate for an integration deal because people know that he has connections outside of South Sudan, is able to get arms and money and get men to rally around him. So he has a rather large threat potential. And so when people look at what he's doing, it creates an incentive to emulate his behavior, because you know that if you pose a big enough threat potential, the government and the military will pay attention to you. And it foments resentment because it's seen as the military or the government rewarding treachery, in essence. Another final impediment to military integration is the delayed implementation of integration causes defection within armed groups. And so between 2010 and 2011, you saw various examples of eventually successful negotiations between the government and armed group leaders, and there would be an agreement to bring forces in, and the armed group commander may bring half or a third of his men in just to see how things go and leave some in the bush just in case the agreement fell through. And because of these civil military disputes between the presidency and national security on one hand and the SPLA on the other in terms of implementing this amnesty and integration deal, the actual implementation would fall through. And as a result, the commander would withdraw with his men into the bush and restart rebellion in order to negotiate a better deal. And so that's why the delayed implementation of integration has caused the redefection of armed groups. Okay, so now we're going to shift a bit and talk about the right sizing of the SPLA. I've presented a historical context of armed groups in South Sudan and given an overview of government efforts to integrate these groups into the SPLA. So at the same time, we're going to talk about this demobilization that the government has an imperative to do in order to transform the SPLA into a conventional military, and also in order to make the military more affordable and effective. So Objective Force 2017 lays out the desired roles, missions, and force structure of the SPLA, given internal and external threats to the country. It envisions a force structure of 120,000 by 2017, which is down from a current parade of upwards of 210,000. No one really knows how many people are in the SPLA, and that's part of the problem with demobilization, which I might get into later. So Objective Force right-sizing the SPLA plausibly allows for the reallocation of funds towards training and improving logistics and mobility so that they can deploy to the periphery to deter communal violence. So for example, the communal violence that periodically goes on in Jonglei State, the government would be, or the SPLA would be more capable, arguably, to respond to that if they had the funding for operations and for mobility. So the success of Objective Force 2017 is contingent on a reduction in force. Some of the right-sizing options that the SPLA is pursuing are to funnel them into the other organized forces. So that is the police service, the prisons, the fire brigade, and wildlife. And that has largely already took place after the signing of the CPA. They also have a nascent Wounded Heroes program, which is being tweaked to ensure that it's not a dumping ground, like as an alternative to DDR before the DDR process really gets off the ground. There's also an idea of a pension program, although that is tied up by the fact that in order to determine how affordable a pension program is, one would need to know how many soldiers are in it, so you would be able to find out how much they would need to pay into the pension program. And so that is also it's an idea that is in concept at this point, but you it still hasn't taken off for the reasons I just mentioned. There's also an idea of a civil work corps, which which is believed could help almost passively downsize the SPLA because it would ensure that the people who are actually in the civil work corps are there to work and not to sit around and wait for something to do. There's also this entity which I know by name, but I'm not too familiar with, that's called the Military Economic Corporation, which was supposed to be for the military to grow its own food and become self-sufficient. Although when I was in South Sudan, people were telling me that that MEC owns casinos, hotels, etc. Again, it's just hearsay because I don't have my own research, my own data points on that, but it seemed to be an idea for like where some forces could be useful within the SPLA. And then finally, most of the soldiers are going through the DDR process, which there had been a DDR process during the interim period of the CPA. It was largely viewed as a failure, and the DDR process is said to be restarting. It was supposed to restart at the end of last year with a pilot group of 500 soldiers, and then it was supposed to be expanded so that the whole, I don't know if it's all 90,000, but several tens of thousands of soldiers are supposed to go through this process before 2017. So some of the challenges to right-sizing the SPLA are the perception that the CPA was merely a ceasefire, and in addition to the border conflict with South Sudan, or with Sudan. So as a result of these border skirmishes in post-conflict Sudan and South Sudan, the SPLA remains at a state of readiness to return to war. And even people who aren't in the security forces right now remain ready to come to the aid of the state in order to defend the country. So that creates a disincentive for the SPLA to demobilize. SPLA now starts to realize that it behooves it to downsize so that it can actually achieve its strategic end state in Objective 4 2017. And another challenge to right-sizing the SPLA is that some demobilization programs are still conceptual, like I mentioned, the pensions program or the civil work corps. And some of these are contingent on the success of DDR because most of the soldiers are going through the DDR process. I don't want to get too much off topic, but when I broached the topic of DDR, there were, at least when I was there in August leading into September of 2012, right before the pilot phase of DDR was supposed to start. The people I spoke with were skeptical as to the donor community's willingness to pay for the DDR process because of the way it had been done during the interim period, and also as a result of the way that South Sudan was pursuing the DDR process. So that has also been an issue with a challenge with regard to right-sizing the SPLA. Another challenge is the lack of economic alternatives to the SPLA. So for very obvious reasons, the government is wary of releasing 90,000 non-essential soldiers into a post-war economy with very few alternative livelihoods. In addition to that, the DDR benefits are perceived to be inefficient to neutralize the threat to armed groups. So what I also discovered is, contrary to efforts to downsize the SPLA, it has actually been growing since the end of since the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. And this is as a result of, as we've discussed before, the integration of armed groups after the Juba Declaration, the recruitment of soldiers during periods of tension with Sudan. So during the border skirmishes during 2012, there were recruitment drives in border areas to get additional soldiers just in case Sudan and South Sudan resorted to war. during this period of tension. There has also been a recruitment of at-risk male youth, and that is in response to the communal violence that has taken place in the greater Upper Nile region. And so in order to prevent male youth from joining these various armed groups, the SPLA has been proactive at bringing them in, at least so that they're on the payroll and so that they can keep an eye on these at-risk youth. There's also been an absence of a centralized personnel management system. And an example of this is that there may be a recruitment drive in Western Bahr al-Ghazal, and soldiers may go in and they may be sitting around waiting for something to do. And for various, actually this happened when I was there, for various reasons, the SPLA may not be able to provide blankets or mosquito nets or food for these soldiers. And so they say, well, I'd be better taken care of in my home area of Eastern Equatoria. And so they leave Bahr al-Ghazal and they go down to their home area in Eastern Equatoria. And they may decide to re-enlist in the military because it provides a steady paycheck and livelihood. At the same time, the unit in Western Bahr al-Ghazal might decide to recruit additional soldiers to replace the soldier that has gone AWOL. And so you have in various regions of South Sudan, you have the military growing because there's no centralized personnel management system to account for the fact that a soldier has gone missing, but he's re-enlisted in a different area. And so that's another reason the SPLA has been growing in recent years. Okay, so some of the potential triggers for armed group violence in South Sudan are political grievances against the SPLM, mostly around election time, which we saw in 2010 with people like George Thor, Gatloak Guy, and David Yao Yao launching rebellions as a result of failed electoral ambitions and the failure to have a stake in the new political dispensation within South Sudan. Another issue that was raised in my interviews was, well, yes, elections are an issue, but when it comes time to succeed Salva Kiir, whether that's in, well, probably not in 2015, but at some point he's going to need to step down. So who will take power after that? And what are the ethnic or tribal implications of that? Who loses out in that process? That is another issue that may spur armed group violence. Another issue is delayed or derailed integration of armed groups into the SPLA, in addition to the issue of officer promotions and perceived marginalization. Earlier on, I referred to Peter Gadet, who in October of 2010 was moved from, I can't remember off the top of my head, but he was moved from a headquarters position to a deputy command in another part of South Sudan, and he perceived that as an emotion, and he perceived that as an effort to mitigate his influence. And so he launched one of his many rebellions after that officer reshuffling. And so I highlighted that as another area in which officer promotions and perceived marginalization as a result of this reshuffling and promotions could be a trigger for armed group violence. You'll notice that in January, and also I think last week, some officers were reshuffled or retired or put into the reserve in the SPLA. I think it's too soon to see what the impact of that will be, but you would need to look at what soldiers were moved, what officers were moved from one position to another, if they were perceived to be marginalized, if there was any sort of ethnic bias that was not transparent. Those are issues that would tell you whether or not this promotion and reshuffling process is a trigger for armed group violence. The process of right-sizing the SPLA is also places tension on this delicate balance between armed groups and what the government and what the military does about them, as well as possible inadequate compensation for DDR and the failure to manage expectations from soldiers going through DDR or other demobilization processes. And then the lack of pay for security forces was an issue that was sometimes raised during the course of my interviews because of the time that I was in South Sudan. It was the time when the oil had not flowed for about 8 months. There were rumors of civil servants not being paid. There were rumors of of, if they ran out of money, then the security forces might not get paid. And people were starting to ask, well, what happens if you stop paying the security forces? Are they going to resort to armed group violence? On one hand, one academic I spoke to said, well, a lot of these guys have a ideology of country first, where they fought for independence and they still believe that whether or not they get paid, they will fight for their country. On the other hand, people who I believe are maybe more realistically minded said, well, with the new state, soldiers acknowledge that the new state has an obligation to pay them. And so the game has changed, where they are no longer expecting to serve the country without getting anything in return. So if the state runs out of money and is unable to pay the security forces, they see that as a potential trigger for armed group violence. And so some of the conclusions I came away with from my research were armed groups are a latent threat that is managed and often mitigated by the government's amnesty and integration policy. The government has either been unwilling or unable to rule by force, and the government's approach to armed groups can be understood as a means by which to remedy the exclusive nature of the comprehensive peace agreement. The government's approach to armed groups has had many vulnerabilities, which I discussed at some detail, and the process is under most stress during periods of political competition and during SPLA promotions or reshuffling. And an additional source of stress may come with the imperative to downsize the SPLA per Objective Force 2017. The success of SPLA transformation has wider impact on South Sudan's security and ability to deter communal violence. That is, if the SPLA were able to improve its operational capabilities as a more professional and conventional military, this would plausibly allow it to move from being a consumer of public goods to an exporter of security in South Sudan. And that is the end of my presentation. So I will now turn it back to Jay.
Thank you, Lesley. I appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and read down through some of the questions that have been submitted by some of our guests. Lesley, could you tell us which parts of South Sudan did you do your research in? Was it Juba?
Sure. Originally, when I'd written the proposal for this project, I had intended to get out to the areas that were most afflicted by armed group violence. So that is Jonglei, Upper Nile, and Unity, in addition to doing interviews in Juba. However, right as I was about to plan my field work, the border skirmishes between Sudan and South Sudan started. And so for liability reasons, I was unable to get outside of Juba for this trip, which I understand is a weakness of this sort of research. I hope that in future trips to South Sudan, I'll be able to get outside of Juba.
Okay. Could you also expand on your thoughts on how the process by which they followed to either do military integration or demobilization? What was their thought process to demobilize a group or keep it integrated?
That is a bit hard to detail. You mean the decision when people make a decision whether to integrate a group into the SPLA or send it through the various demobilization mechanisms? That is not transparent to me, but it's an area that I should look into in future research. And I think one of the challenges with integration and demobilization is that some of these armed groups that have been integrated into the SPLA don't believe that that the government has given them a transparent has been transparent about their decisions whether or not they're going to integrate certain groups or demobilize them.
Okay, and I've got kind of a two-parter here. What causes the SPLA to be less mobile after the Civil War? Did they lose equipment or vehicles? I mean, is this immobility a part of the peace agreement?
The way it was explained to me is that the SPLA during the Civil War was they were more mobile on their feet, so they were more willing and capable of marching to wherever they needed to go in order to address whatever threat there was to South Sudan. Again, the way it was explained to me is that with South Sudan becoming an independent state and with the SPLA on the way to become a professional military, a lot of these soldiers lost those sorts of skills, or lost that ability to be a bush soldier, and they lost the willingness to be able to address threats in that manner, and they expected to be able to have the mobility of a modern state. I don't know that that is the best explanation for it, but that's the way it was explained to me. And another reason could be that um, I don't know what their mobility was during the Civil War, but I do know that mobility is an issue now because it is expected that they would have be able to get out to peripheral areas to
So
address
does
security threats.
this mobility or the lack of
Yeah,
mobility,
that's
the government's ability to provide that, does that make does it make it more difficult or to keep the military under the thumb of the government, or is that a way to be less? Is the inability to provide this additional mobility make it less of an instrument for the government? If that makes any sense.
I don't think, well, again, as an outside observer, I don't think it's intentional, although one of the people I interviewed said that one of the reasons that the SPLA doesn't have sufficient money for operations is that there are people within the government that don't want it to, and that could also trickle down to lack of mobility. So I know that's not a complete answer to the question, but
Okay.
that's
Hey,
the insight I have on
I'm
that
sorry.
particular issue.
Reading through some of these questions as I go down here, could you provide some additional insight onto the cause for the failed DDR process?
Sure. One of the causes for the failed DDR process during the interim period of the CPA was that the CPA was viewed as a ceasefire rather than as a permanent peace agreement, and so both um, both parties, both the National Congress Party in the north and the SPLM, SPLA in the south, were reluctant to demobilize their forces when there was a decent chance that they would need these forces to be able to wage a war in the future. In addition, again, off the top of my head, I believe that one of the issues was there was a mismatch in terms of the expectations on the part of soldiers going through the DDR process in South Sudan with regard to what they would get from the DDR process. It was not effectively communicated to them either by the donor community or the South Sudanese government. And I believe that there was also as I mentioned earlier, a lack of ownership in terms of the SPLA realizing that it needed to downsize and that it needed to go through this DDR process. And one of the things that came up in my interview was that in my interviews were that there was a disparity in the way that the South Sudanese and the donor community approached DDR. So the donor community saw it as a way to provide for human demobilizing when they need to.
Okay, and I think we have another question here, and then we have some comments afterward. The given that the lack of economic possibilities and employment and the inability to provide resources is a factor in both the recruitment and the retention of military members. How do you see the economic development being addressed currently, and how do you think it ought to be?
So I think that economic development is being addressed.
Right. How is that is either as currently enabling or currently being leveraged into shaped how the military is operating?
I think that the situation in South Sudan in terms of the economic development is very much constrained by the fact that the oil is still not flowing after 13 months. And so even when DDR was first conceived, during the interim period of the CPA, or prior to the signing of the CPA, I think there was an assumption that the donor community would kick in some funding, and then South Sudan would be able to provide some funding, which would contribute to the reintegration support that South Sudanese soldiers would receive. And I think as a result of compromising uh, the compromised position that South Sudan's economy finds itself in, there are still more limited opportunities for economic development. But in terms of some of the programs, at least that exist in concept for providing employment for demobilized soldiers, I believe that part of the ongoing pilot program for DDR includes training on things like carpentry, construction, farming for these soldiers to have, so that they have so that they have options to provide for their own livelihoods.
Great, Leslie, appreciate it. Great presentation, and we have some additional folks that wanted to get online and interact with you, but the snowstorm that's happening here in Kansas City has caused some folks to fall off the net. I'd like to be able to pass information to you, and for anybody that's listening now or on the recording, if you can pass your questions to info@culturalknowledge.org, I will make sure that Ms. Warner gets all of the questions and all of the comments. I'd also like to highlight that our own regional functional scholar for Africa, Dr. Clara Metellitz, is online. And if you'd like to interact with both of them, and I'd also like to make sure that she gets in touch with you, Lesley, so that you can follow up and discuss all the great in-depth details. We'll be able to get all those connections made. Did you have any closing comments, Lesley?
No, thank you all for listening, and thanks for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm sorry I'm unable to read all of your comments at this particular time. I have limited bandwidth, but I plan on going through them, and I hope that you'll be able to get in touch with me through Jay in the future for follow-up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lesley, and I'll make sure to send the transcript of all the chat to you as soon as I can. Folks, on behalf of the CKC Director, Mr. Carl Prinsloo, I'd like to sincerely extend our appreciation to Lesley Warner for sharing with us here today. Again, the recording of this presentation will be available on the CKC YouTube channel as soon as possible. The channel address is youtube.com/user/cultural knowledge, all one word. You can also find a link to it on our website. As long as we're talking about the website, the contact information, the CKC blog, discussion forums, and other resources are available on our website at www.culturalknowledge.org. If you have a topic, or you know of someone that would like to present during our speaker series, or if you know of someone that might, please email or call us at speakers@culturalknowledge.org. That's also a good address. If you have any questions for Ms. Warner, we'll make sure that we pass them to her. I sure appreciate you being here. Thank you, and we will see you next time. Our next speaker presentation is our collaboration with Kansas University, and that'll be this coming Monday at 12 noon. And for those of you that are watching a recording of it, that recording will also be available on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much again to Ms. Warner, and thank you all for being here. That's all for CKC, and we're out.